Hello everybody, this is for my U.S. History 2 students. Still looking at World War I, the final concept of World War I. We'll be looking at President Woodrow Wilson's role in the peace settlement after World War I. So this peace settlement needs to be evaluated into basically two parts. One, his goals, his aspirations, which was to create a fair, just, and lasting peace, and to do so for all nations on the earth. Basically, he wanted to create an international political organization called the League of Nations. And so, basically, his goal, given the aftermath and given the horrific nature of World War I, he wanted to create an institutional way of creating peace on the planet forever. I mean, there would be conflict, obviously, but he wanted to have a mechanism, an international mechanism in place where conflict could be resolved in a more rational, logistic way rather than bombing and killing each other. The other way we want to evaluate Wilson's role in the aftermath of World War I is his failures, both domestically and overseas. So the real interesting thing about the end of World War I is it marks a turning point and a harbinger of things to come as far as the United States' role in the world. We get a little bit of that in the Spanish-American War, but it's very clear after World War I that the United States will be taking a leading role in international affairs. Those that, quote-unquote, won the war, who lost the war, who were neutral, all realize that the United States' involvement decided the conflict. And so, in doing so, the whole world looked with great expectation to the United States to win the peace. And they're looking at one person during this time period, the President of the United States, Woodrow Wilson. All right, so he's stepping into a world stage that has just finished this bloody conflict that the United States was involved in the latter part of it. The European War, or the Great War as it was called, lasted from 1914 to 1917, and the United States got involved in it in 1917, and it definitely decided the outcome. This is still an age of extreme nationalism, and this is going to thwart a lot of what Wilson is going to try to accomplish. So, nationalists in Great Britain and in France are going to stall and thwart Wilson's goal, basically, to make sure that everybody is dealt with fairly. The war was, the United States lost a lot of soldiers in the war, but relatively to other nations, it was relatively unscathed and untouched, right? The war was a bit more personal for people living in Europe, and so it's going to be very difficult for people in Europe to let bygones be bygones, to forgive and forget. So nationalists in England and in France are going to want a pound of flesh from Germany, who they saw responsible for the war. But in 1918, Wilson enunciated his famous 14 points as the basis for a lasting peace. In his blueprint for peace, Wilson had declared that war was, quote, a war for freedom and justice and self-government amongst all the nations of the world. A war to make the world safe for the people who live upon it and have made it their own, the German people themselves included, right? And so that aspect of extending this kind of blanket forgiveness and trying to start anew is not going to be taken too well by the British and the French. With the speech, however, Wilson made himself a new kind of world leader, representing not wealth and power, but morality and justice, as millions of people at home and abroad flocked to his standard, right? Trying to create a new sense of what it means to have nation states within the world in a modern context. It was on the basis of the 14 points that the Germans agreed to end the war. And let me just show you the 14 points. So the 14 points, Wilson's 14 points, were first outlined in a speech gave to the American Congress in January 1918. The same speech I just quoted about all nations giving basically a fair chance, including the German people. And this is the speech that, and these 14 points that were articulated at the speech were the points in which Germans decided to stop fighting. So Wilson's 14 points became the basis for a peace program, and it was on the back of the 14 points, again, that Germany is going to sign an armistice. So, 1, no more secret agreements, open covenants openly arrived at, right? So, no backroom deals, no backroom allegiances from here on out. Free navigations of the seas, both at peacetime and in wartime. An end to all economic barriers between countries, meaning tariffs. Countries to reduce the weapon numbers, so a reduction in armistice. All decisions regarding the colonies should be impartial. So there was going to be a serious look at how colonies were set up, which were basically places of closed markets, right? A colony is a place where you have trade barriers where only the French could trade and exploit the resources within that area, or the English, or the Belgium, or the Americans. The Americans had colonies as well. Right? So they wanted to take a hard look at the structure of colonies and the legacy of them. The German army was to be removed from Russia. Russia should be left to develop its own political setup. Belgium should be independent, just as before the war. France should fully be liberated and allowed to recover. All Italians are to be allowed to live in Italy. Italy's borders are to, quote, along clearly recognizable lines of nationality. 10. Self-determination should be allowed for all those living in Austria-Hungary. 11. Self-determination and guarantees of independence should be allowed for the Balkan states. 12. The Turkish people should be governed by the Turkish government. Non-Turks in the old Turkish Empire should govern themselves. 13. An independent Poland should be created, which should have access to the sea. And 14, and probably the most important one, a League of Nations should be set up to guarantee the political and territorial independence of all states. So, nearly all of Wilson's points, if you notice it closely, deal with political, military, or territorial issues. The only economic proposal in the whole list was a vague statement on the removal of trade barriers, which was an important point, but it really didn't have any specifics. This lack of consideration for economic problems which plagued Europe after the war is considered to be the major weakness of Wilson's 14 points and the Peace of Paris in 1918. The lack of an economic base to the peace will prepare Europe for World War II. Wilson's second goal was to create the League of Nations. The League would be a permanent international body in which all nations, without sacrificing their sovereignty, should meet together to discuss and settle disputes, each promising not to resort to war. Few European statesmen had the confidence in such a league, but they yielded to Wilson, and the Charter of the League of Nations was written into the treaty with Germany. In return, Wilson had to make concessions to Great Britain, to the French, and to the Japanese. He was obliged to compromise the idealism for the 14 points. So he just figured that in compromising a little bit with the victors, basically, of the war, he could those things could be ironed out in future meetings at the League of Nations. His failures started at home. The American delegation was headed by Wilson himself, which was his first mistake. Since he was convinced that he alone could persuade the Allies to make some sort of peace that he envisioned, right? So he's micromanaging the whole process. Wilson knew that the French and the British, and still more the Italians, had their own national aims, which they were completely unwilling to sacrifice for the wider goals. Another major reason for the later war, World War II. Wilson purposely chose a weak delegation as he expected to compose the treaty himself. So again, he's micromanaging it. Wilson wanted to fight for his brainchild, the League of Nations, and Wilson ignored protocol of having the opposition party represented, the Republican Party, and he only had one Republican at the five-piece delegation, which that five-piece delegation really had no voice except for his. The person he should have definitely invited was Henry Cabot Lodge, who was the head of foreign relations in the Senate, but he was political enemies with Henry Cabot Lodge, and so Wilson kind of put his ego first there and didn't invite him. And so this is going to pose a problem because the 14 points and the League of Nations is basically a treaty, and the president can make all the treaties he wants, but he's got to bring them back to the Senate, and the Senate is the one that confirms the president's treaties. And since he's snubbed the opposition party, the Senate is not going to go for it, and they're going to reject the League of Nations. Wilson's second failure from overseas in negotiation of the peace happens with his lack of understanding the difficulties of having dispersed people within national borders, and so there was no real way of creating nation states that reflected national borders. So this is going to plague Europe between the end of World War I all the way up through World War II, and it will represent basically the 14 points will become manifest without the United States involvement, but by the 1930s the League of Nations is going to dissolve because of these unanswered questions of minorities living within nation states that really don't have a say within those nation states and aren't really represented by their people. Well, that's the end of the World War I lecture. I'll talk to you guys later. Email me if you have questions.